Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I don't actually have any yellow clothes. I'm sorry, Richard, but you might have got the email. Anyway, I am hoping in the space of the next 20 minutes to give you all a new tool, a new way of thinking about design. And in fact, I think my talk really should be called What Food Can Do, because that's what it's about. This is my favorite slide for describing a place that I call Sitopia, and I'm going to explain a bit later why I call it Sitopia, so just let that sort of word drift into that back part of your brains for now. But essentially, the reason I love this image is that I am an architect, and I remember going to visit Siena, which is where it's from, about sort of 20 years ago or something, and saying, oh, that's a lovely picture of Siena, and wandering off again. And it was only when I had this kind of weird light bulb going off in my head, which was that actually food could be a really interesting way of trying to understand what a city was, that I looked at this image again and went, wow, it's all about food. Why didn't I see that before? And it still strikes me as really odd that I hadn't seen it. But let me just show you why it's all about food. You can see a city on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you can see a beautifully crafted landscape, olive groves, vineyards, and so on. You can see people working away very hard in the fields. You can see a group of huntsmen leaving the city, presumably to go and shoot a boar or something for dinner. You can see pigs wandering into the city. And just inside the city gate, you see two asses with grain on their backs, bringing grain into the city, and a flock of sheep wandering around, and so on. Food is kind of travelling backwards and forwards between the city and the countryside. And what I love about this image is that it's called an allegory of the effects of good government. Because actually it's a very unique moment in our civilization when this profound synergetic symbiosis between city and country was really recognized. Now, there are profound historical reasons for that if I had 20 hours I could go into in great detail. I don't. But nevertheless, what it boils down to is that food shapes our lives, and I'm going to, as I say, try to flesh out for you a bit more accurately how that happens and why maybe we don't see it as much as perhaps we could. And I quite often say that food it's a bit like God, really. It's everywhere, but it's too big to see, so we just miss it. Anyway, that was a kind of a joke, but anyway, never mind. It's okay. Of course, one of the reasons that we don't see this very profound relationship that we rely on as city dwellers, and I don't have to tell you that more than half of the global population now live in cities, is because the relationship is now a bit more like this. You don't kind of look out your window and see something worth painting, which is the fields where we're fed from. In fact, most of our food comes from thousands of miles away. We're fed on a just-in-time basis, which means that most of the food that you and I are going to be eating, I'm from London or in Amsterdam, is actually the other side of the world at the moment. It hasn't come here yet. I know probably pigs, chicken and eggs you already have sorted in the Netherlands, but other things maybe are coming from elsewhere. And of course, a lot of the meat that you eat will have been fed on soya beans grown in Brazil, like in this field on the right-hand side. Now, I call this the urban paradox because if you think of us as humans, and I think, I completely agree with David, I think, we are always in a constant state of design, and if not, why not? But, we're trying to puzzle about life and how we should dwell, and I suppose as an architect, the dwelling issue, you could say, is a summary of what I think, I'm spending my time doing. Now, the paradox comes because as humans, we have two loose sets of needs. We need one another. We need to be sociable. I mean, it would be very tragic if I was standing here talking in an empty theatre. But, maybe quite interesting in other ways. But nevertheless, we can only become we can only become ourselves if we have each other. So we increasingly gather together in bigger communities called cities in order to enjoy the fruits of our sort of togetherness, if you like. But we still remain animals, we still have natural needs, and those come from a place that increasingly, as you can see on the right-hand side, are kind of nature, but they're not nature, and the whole question of what is nature comes into it. Now, the paradoxical nature of this is that there is no ideal solution. And in fact, there are scales at which you can try to resolve these two needs, which are essentially in conflict. So at the top, if you like, I've drawn a sort of rough representation of what life was like before cities. So on the left-hand side, you see a lonely man wandering through a forest, obviously sort of going hunting or something. And on the right-hand side, you see a representation of what he might have been looking for. In other words, naturally forest-dwelling food. Now, if you follow your food around the forest and it's seasonal and so on, there isn't really any point in building cities because, A, you can't feed them, and B, you need to move around and follow your food. So you have to be a sort of small, mobile unit of food-seeking people and maybe live, shall we say, in tribes of up to 30 or maybe a little bit bigger. Now, the image I showed you, the Lorenzetti allegory of the effects of good government of Siena in the 14th century, is a really interesting moment in the evolution of the urban model in which the city was still limited in size and could be fed from its local hinterland. And that kind of city can exist up to, say, 30,000 people. And that's about the limit. And then, of course, what we're doing at the moment is we're growing much bigger cities. And the question is, how are we doing that? Because where is this food coming from and how are we physically bringing it into the city? Now, I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second, but just to say that at whatever scale you do this, you've got a problem. So at the top, you might be a little bit lonely. And at the bottom, of course, there's this problem of the food coming from a long way away and the logistics that we were just hearing about and all sorts of other issues. And the middle is kind of interesting, shall we say, and I'm going to come back to that. But nevertheless, there's never really an ideal solution to this business of feeding cities. Very, very briefly, it started about 10,000 years ago, this experiment in living, and it came from a major food crisis, and the food crisis was the end of the last ice age, when the sort of hunting and gathering lifestyle became very difficult in this region because all the big animals were moving north with the ice, and people, to cut a very long story short, began to experiment with grain as a source of food instead of meat and berries and so on, and hence the sort of muesli versus, a slice of meat on top of your... Anyway, it wouldn't have been toast, of course, because toast didn't exist. Now, there are many things to say about this, but briefly, grain as a source of food, which was radical and people didn't much like eating it at the beginning, which is why farming is always portrayed as a punishment in books like the Bible and so on. But nevertheless, actually you have to be in the right place at the right time to harvest the grain. And to cut a very long short, as I say, on the eastern Mediterranean seaboard, farming communities they began to spring up about 10,000 years ago to exploit local grain as well as hunt and gather. And then slowly a group of cities evolved, the first really that we can call cities at the top of the Persian Gulf, which were big enough sort of communities, if you like, and static communities to be called cities. Now, all I want you to take from this slide is that agriculture and cities co-evolved, and you can't have cities without agriculture. And you can't have agriculture without cities, actually, as it turns out, either. What were those cities like? Again, give me 20 hours and I'll tell you a lot more. But basically, all I want you to get from this slide, this is one of the first cities ever built, is that they were dense, they were small, they were compact, they were on rivers, and they were surrounded by their farmland. And last but not least, if you look at this map of Ur, right in the middle is an enormous temple complex. Okay, yes. You need a spiritual centre to the city. What is the city about? But interestingly, the temple was also the practical centre of the city. It organised the harvest, and this was the most important thing it did. And in fact, writing was evolved in order to keep the farming accounts. So this is, if you like, a radical experiment in how to live based on a food crisis and a sort of evolution of what it means to eat grain and the level of cooperation required, and also sort of municipal earthworks to harvest the water coming down and use it to irrigate the land over the course of the year. This complicated level of life really gave rise to what we now call urban civilization. Now, not all cities followed that model. If that's model A, if you like, Rome was model B, it kind of went the other way. Instead of saying, yes, we're going to feed ourselves from a sort of little patch of farmland outside, they basically built a navy and went off somewhere else in search for food. So Rome had about 1 million population by the 1st century AD. And the question is, how did a city like that feed itself in the ancient world? And the answer is ancient food miles. So you may have heard of food miles and think they're a modern phenomenon, and of course they are. are really sort of radicalized now, but they are not new. The only way a city the size of Rome could have fed itself was by getting its food from overseas. It would have been physically impossible to transport the food overland. If you just think of ox carts and, okay, the Romans are good at building roads, but, not that good. Ox carts, load the grain on. It simply would have been physically impossible. So the grain ships coming in from Alexandria and the northern African coast and so on were the supertankers of their day. And in fact, Rome was also fed on a just-in-time basis. And it was also a highly political act because about a third of Romans were fed on a free grain dole called the ananar. And if they thought that the grain coming in was threatened in any way, they rioted. They stormed the Senate House. So it was a hugely political thing, feeding Rome, and a very difficult thing. And you might just want to take a look at that map and think, well, it would have been quite tough for another city the size of Rome to have existed anywhere in the region because there simply wouldn't have been enough food. And that, in fact, is the case, which is why Rome subsequently waged war on cities like Carthage and Alexandria simply in order to get its paws on their grain reserves, but also simply in order to get rid of its rivals for resources. So I often say that, the expansion of the Roman Empire is a bit like a large militarized shopping spree, effectively. Now, of course, we're in a city which I don't have to tell you has a history which is very much bound up with grain. And in fact, it's a fascinating city to analyse through food. And if I just tell you that all cities that were founded before the motor car are profoundly shaped by food, and you can actually trace the way food was arriving in the city by looking at wonderful maps like this, I urge you to go and sort of have a look at this wonderful Blau map from 1574. But very, very basically, of course, as I don't have to tell you, the great thing about Amsterdam was that it controlled the Baltic grain trade. So the poor old Poles were producing the grain, but it was the Dutch that had the good idea of taking it and sort of selling it on to somebody else. So you've been trading in food for hundreds of years. And if you look at where the food was coming in from, of course, ocean-going vessels bringing the food up the river to the dam, which was where the Amstel was dammed. And of course, that is the main place where the grain was traded and also where the fish was coming in. Of course, meat is not coming in by sea, it's coming in by land, so it's walking in, coming in at the top. Rembrandtplein and Muntplein at the northwest were the old cattle markets and also dairy markets, and Kalverstraat is where the animals used to walk down to the dam when the dam was the main market for everything. And then fruit and veg you can see growing in the suburbs and coming into places like Neumarkt on the western side there, and beer coming in by river as well. So again, it's a very complicated story, but just to say that, you can see from street names and also from the geography of the city how every city that was founded before the industrial era was shaped by food. And if we look at a picture of des Dames from 1604, you can really see it all happening. There are the ships on the right-hand side bringing in grain, the most important food of every city, as I was explaining, and also fish, clearly, into this central space. And you can see the weighing house where, of course, all of the food coming in had to be tested for quality and quantity. So that's the commercial building, overlooked by the town hall, because, of course, this is the most important thing going on in the city is the grain trade and the food trade. And so the city has to sort of, as it were, be politically in control of that. And then behind it, you see the cathedral. So basically, God's looking over the whole thing, making sure, checking out it's okay too. So commerce, civic order, and God is basically what you've got. And this is the same in market spaces all over the world. It's the fundamental civic order, and it's all evolved around food. And the other thing to say clearly is that, of course, because the cities had to be compact, like was, you had to be able to walk easily into the middle of the city. The market space was often the only public space in the city. So also it was a place where you would go to find out news, gossip, you would celebrate, you would feel seasonality. The market was the heart of every pre-industrial city. Now, that was the case until this thing got built. Now, this is the first railway on Earth, built in 1831. It was actually built to take coal from Liverpool, which is a port, to Manchester, which was an evolving industrial city in the middle of England. And what I love about this image is that you can see that, the top shows you why the railway was actually built, which was to shift coal. But on the bottom, you can see that they thought, ooh, actually, we can take farm animals backwards and forwards on this thing as well. Hey, it's a complete game changer, because if very, very quickly I've been trying to sketch on for you sort of how cities were limited by geography, by their ability or otherwise to feed themselves, all of a sudden the railway changes everything. You don't have to have access to the sea anymore and to shipping. You can just bring food in by railway. And three things profoundly change at this moment. One is that the visibility of food, which had cohabited in the same physical spaces as people, suddenly starts to travel down its own routes, its own industrialized pathway, so it begins to become invisible. Secondly, cities are emancipated from geography. They can be built any shape, any place, anywhere. And last and not least, the civic authorities, who always used to take very good care that food was traded in the open and make sure that nobody had monopolistic control of it, thought, oh, thank goodness for that, don't have to worry about the food thing anymore. Let's leave it up to these frightfully good food companies who are so good at shifting food around. Now, all of these things have profound consequences that we're living with today. This is the growth of London in the 80 years after the railways came. On the left, it's more or less the same size it was as a medieval city. On the right, technical term, it's turned into a sort of metropolitan splurge. You know, I mean, a kind of city that you could possibly feed from just one or two little markets in the middle. That's radical. Secondly, as cities splurge, so do the food landscapes feeding them, because, of course, the railways also make it possible to shift grain long distances, and therefore you got an amazing grain surplus in countries like America, where suddenly thousands of acres of land became available for grain growing. So they had the brilliant idea of feeding the grain to animals rather than humans, and then feeding the animals to the humans, which of course is what we do now. So about a third of the global grain harvest is fed to animals and then us, and it takes about 10 times as much grain to feed us if it's been through an animal first, so it's an extremely ecologically expensive way of feeding us. And there are many, many other issues with this, which I'll briefly touch on. It's terrible. You see, that's nearly, how many? That's about 10. Ooh. Anyway, I'll go even faster now. You thought that was fast. So after the train comes the car, of course, and these kinds of landscapes that nobody would walk in their right minds. In fact, what we do, as you know, is we drive to a box outside the city, we buy the food, we come back, we think, why on earth did I buy that, stick it in the fridge and wait for it to go off. You know, they have this completely disconnected relationship with food now. The food has to be denatured in order to withstand the distribution patterns that it has to follow. Of course, we don't go to the middle of the city to talk to people in a market anymore and have a social interaction. We leave the city to go and buy our food in boxes that are outside the city, because the food is following the logic of food logistics, which is that, you know, you take them in lorries, white vans, obviously, I now realise, to a big box on the outside of the city, and we go to the food. So it's a complete reversal of the sort of thousands-year-old logic of the relationship between food and cities. You get what I call the eviscerated city, with cities with actually food taken out of them, because basically where poor people live, as in this map of New York, you can see the Bronx and Harlem, the red areas that are designated as food deserts, where people live more than half a kilometre away from a source of fresh food. Why? Because the food system is now entirely commercially driven, so the food goes where the money is, and that's it. Of course, the results of that, I have to stop. I mean, to be honest, I've only had 10 minutes so far, because it was so late. I think that's wrong. No, honestly, I started at 11:05, didn't I?
Wait, because it's terrible, because we...
Oh, no, I mean, fine. Yes, very, very, yes, 3 minutes.
No, because
I'll go on.
Yeah, you go on 1 minute, okay?
So we know the results of the modern food system. I think we know this story fairly well. We probably have some idea of the incredible global ecological impact of the way we're feeding ourselves now. Fresh water, land degradation, climate change, the diet transition I was talking about. People are eating far more meat as they move into cities, particularly in places like China, and 1.4 million city dwellers, rural dwellers every week moving into cities. So the greatest human migration in history history, basically. Are we learning our lessons? Because, interestingly, 100 years ago, there was a huge expose of the horrific conditions in the jungle in this Chicago Stockyards, and I'm sure I don't have to tell you recently we had horse meat all over again. No, we did not learn the lesson. And of course, the whole world is turning into a hamburger. Why? Because this is a kind of what I call lowest common denominator food. Basically, everybody loves it. It evolved in America for reasons of people trying to get on with one another from very different cultures. And of course, it's very commercially driven. So there's a huge effort being made by the people who control the food system, who are commercial, to push this worldwide. Now, what are we going to do about it, which is the kind of interesting bit, which I have about 30 seconds to talk about. Just tell me, you've got another 5 minutes or something?
Oh, you're already over 5 minutes. I don't even have time to ask questions anymore. People are doing this behind the scenes.
That wasn't adjusted. It was running late, and it hasn't adjusted for the fact it was running late. Do you see what I mean? I began at 11:05.
Richard wil meer tijd.
It didn't adjust for the fact that we were 10 minutes late. That's the point.
Okay, well.
So, anyway. Thank you. What are we going to do about it? It's not a new question. In fact, for as long as people have been building cities, they've been saying, how on earth are we going to sustain this thing? In fact, Plato in his Ideal Republic said we have to limit the size to which a city can grow, and then if it gets too big, we have to send people off and found one somewhere else. So it's an old problem. It's never been easy feeding cities. And in fact, if you look at the utopian tradition, everyone's sort of wondering about this dwelling problem I was talking about at the beginning. It's all about the relationship, as I was saying, between the city and the countryside, and how do you find a balance between the two? So if we look at Thomas More's Utopia, written in 1516, it was actually a critique of London. He's basically saying, we need a country which has a series of limited in size, self-sufficient city-states in a kind of network, and basically everybody farms for 2 years of their life, and the whole thing is built around this sort of the problem of how you bind city and country together. And Ebenezer Howard, I'm sure some of you have heard about the Garden City idea. It's really basically Thomas More with railways. It's essentially the same idea, limited city-states of about 30,000 people living in them, interestingly, and then joined up by railway, so that you have enough people living within a sort of half-hour's journey of one another to have, shall we say, and in fact his definition of civilization is you can put together a decent symphony orchestra. So I often say actually that right-hand side model is a bit like the Netherlands. It's one way of going. So that's, if you like, going back to the first ever urban model that we came up with. But there have been other people saying the opposite. They say, actually, the city thing, it doesn't work. Frank Lloyd Wright was one of them. He was a city hater. A lot of utopians are. And he basically said, we have to stop building cities altogether, and we just have to turn the whole of America back into a large farm. The problem with that was that he said, the way people were going to socialize with one another was they would just fly around in helicopters. So that didn't work. I'm sure you've heard of vertical farms. I did some maths. I worked out you need 2,000 of them to feed London, 30 stories high and 100 metres and 100 metres. So, my question is, if you actually tried to feed London from itself, what would it look like? And it occurred to me that, some of you might know Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin for Paris. Perhaps that's what we'd have to do. If we went down this model, just basically obliterate the city and stick farms in it. It's completely ridiculous. You can't do it. And the point is, this is why I call it the urban paradox. You can't feed a city from within itself. That's what we call the countryside. That's the point. So it doesn't work. Now, it doesn't work, and therefore there is no ideal solution to this problem. And in fact, the word utopia tells you that, because it has a double meaning. It can either mean a good place or no place. And it struck me as really sad that our sort of most multidisciplinary tradition of thinking about the problem of dwelling leads you, utopianism, to something that you can't have. So I thought, well, we already live in Sitopia. We already live in a world shaped by food. The word simply means food place, and that's the word I showed you at the beginning. So the question is, if we understand how profoundly food shapes our world, how can we use food as a tool to shape it better? I'll be very, very quick here. But basically, it's a flow going from the countryside to the city, a constant flow that we have to mould. We also have to understand it's very complex. It's to do with our culture. It's to do with who we are. If we look at what we eat in the course of a week, then we can extrapolate many things. We can say, what kind of landscape are we producing? Do we meet another human? Do we sort of have social capital when we buy and sell food, or we just go to a box and kind of talk to a packet? You know, do we have people who can recognize a raw vegetable, or do we just kind of have, you know, sort of factory meals that we sort of shovel in on the way to doing something more important? Do we eat with one another? This is the basis of every society on earth. Or do we, as in America, eat our meals in a car? 19% of the meals in America are now eaten in a car. So what does that say about where society's going? And do we waste food? Do we value food? Because if you don't value it, you waste it. And we waste up to a third of the food that we produce. So we're clearly not valuing it now. And my question is, how does all of that stuff feed into an understanding of what a good life is? And that really is my question. We can use food as a tool to question what kind of society we're building, and we can also use food to mould it differently. Because the beautiful thing about food, unlike utopia, is that tiny decisions that we make can make very big differences. There isn't a level playing field. If we internalize the true cost of hamburgers, they should cost $200 and not $2. And the problem is the consolidation within the food industry, which looks like this, with the supermarkets and the big conglomerates in the middle. We need this. We need to join up round the edges of that to democratize food. 2 more slides. There is a food movement going on. This is what it might look like. Here is my gift to you. It's to see the world through food. Just have Setopian glasses on, and the world will see different. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.